Yes. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our today's session. My name is Polash Sanial. I'm the Strategic Partnership and Project Manager at the Global Institute for Water Security based in Canada, University of Saskatchewan. Um, um, so we are here to our today's session, Global Assessment Characterizing Private Sector Water Impact, focuses on one of the report we published in April 2022 in collaboration with Ceres and Global Institute for Water Security. Those of you who don't know about Global Institute for Water Security, we're the top research institute in Canada and one of the largest freshwater research institute. And Ceres is a not-for-profit working with investors, asset managers, industry for over 3 decades. We have a great line of speakers today who are involved with the project throughout the last 3 years in different phases from initiation. We'll hear a bit about the background. Actually, it all started 3 years ago here in Stockholm from a conversation with Ceres that turned into a project and this scientific study. And later on, we'll have a panel of 4 people talking about how such collaboration can be harnessed in different ways for impacting decision makers, investors, and others. So at first, we have Jay Famliati with us. Jay is the executive director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan and the chief scientist at WaterPlan. His research team uses satellite and develop computer models to track how freshwater availability is changing around the world. This work has driven his interest in corporate water sustainability and stewardship, innovations in financial tools and data-driven reporting platforms, and international water diplomacy. So Jay will be talking about the background in the beginning, and then later on, we'll be giving a brief overview of the report. So over to you, Jay.
Thanks very much, Palash. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm feeling really jet lagged and hoping that I don't fall off this stool. So as Palash mentioned, this particular journey started in 2019 when we met Monica Freimund, who was formerly of Ceres, here at World Water Week. And I asked how researchers and research institutes like the one that I direct could support the efforts of a nonprofit like Ceres. And really, to be honest, I think this report has much deeper roots, really going back to 2012 when I first was introduced to Ceres, and then in 2013, which was the first time that I came to World Water Week with 3 of my students, one of whom is here, Kate Voss, who's now joined Ceres. At that time, and I think that this is still true, it was pretty clear that there were very few academics that attend World Water Week, and it made me wonder on the nonprofit and NGO side, who's supporting, right, and who's partnering with this vital sector to provide the latest research. So next slide. Palash, some of that research is shown here, and if you know me, you know I can't really give a talk or write a report without including this figure. So this is a map of changes in freshwater storage, the trends from the NASA GRACE and GRACE follow-on missions. So 20 years of data. And the reds are places that are losing water. I see that the ice sheets are left out of this, but the ice sheets would be the most red, Greenland and Antarctica. But the red places have been losing water over the last 20 years because of things like ice melting, permafrost melting, drought, groundwater depletion. And the blue places are places that are getting wetter because of increased flooding and changes in broad patterns of precipitation. So you see there's a pretty compelling picture there, I think. And I won't break it down too much, except to say that a lot of what we're looking at, and I don't think we have a pointer, but you know, let's just go sort of take a tour of, you know, I want to point out the widespread groundwater depletion that's happening, because this is where I think there's a role for industry and for investors to use water more wisely. So a lot of the hotspots there, like the Central Valley in California, the Southern High Plains. If we head over to Africa, the northern tip of Africa, there is the Northwest Sahara Aquifer System. Of course, Europe is having a terrible year this year, and there's a lot of groundwater depletion that's happening here. Down in the Middle East, northwestern India and Bangladesh are some of the perennial hotspots for groundwater depletion. North China Plain, southern part of the swing back over, going from east to west, the southern part of Africa, and then the Rio Colorado and Rio Negro groundwater depletion happening just above the Patagonia region in South America. So, we had a study that came out, I think it was 2015, that said over half of the world's major aquifers, there's 37 that are recognized by the UN, and at that point, over half were being rapidly depleted. So that's not good news. And so there's a bottom line message of this map, which is it's driven by climate change and by human water management. So really it's driven entirely by humans. And on the water use side, especially the groundwater depletion side, that's happening largely because of industry and the food industry. And most of that groundwater depletion is happening because of irrigation. So we're looking at, as long as groundwater continues to disappear, then not only is it a water security problem, it's a food security problem as well. And so we have to figure out this balance, because we need water for food, we need water for agriculture, we need water for environment, we need water to produce energy, right? We need water for people. So anyway, this work has led me to realize that we can't really move the needle on global water security without deep industry engagement. But the question for me has always been, how do you do that? How do I do that engagement? Advocate for policy, done that. Show this map around Congress in the United States and Parliament in Canada, done that. Lost it. Just getting to the good stuff. There we go. Writing, media, done all that. And it's not having a huge impact. So when Monica suggested that we might contribute to series efforts by doing an academic literature review, we were really excited for the possibilities. Series put out an RFP, and for the global assessment report that we're talking about today, we submitted our proposal, we were selected, and here we are a few years later. The idea behind the report, as Kirsten James may share with you, is that it will be combined with materiality briefs, like those that Paul Reek, who's not here yet, but he'll be running in a little bit later, will tell you about, to inform investor expectations for corporate water sustainability. But we still have to get down to the industry level and to help them on their water journeys. It's not just investors. And so Jose Galindo will speak to how platforms like WaterPlan can bring some of the latest science, remote sensing, to improve risk assessment tools and bring them down to the facility level. So I think with that, Palash.
Thanks, Jay.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. So we'll also hear from the perspective of Ceres what's going on and why they invested in studies like this. So we have with us Kirsten James. Kirsten James is the Senior Program Director for the Water Program at Ceres. In this role, she directs Ceres' strategy for mobilizing leading investors and companies to address the sustainability risk facing our freshwater and agriculture systems. She also leads Ceres' global investor-led corporate engagement initiative, the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. So Kirsten, over to you.
Great, thank you, Palash. And okay, I think this is on. Great, well, it's wonderful to be here with you all. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to build on what Jay shared and provide sort of the Ceres perspective of why the science and the research matters in moving the private sector on water issues. So taking a step back, as Palash shared, Ceres has worked for over 3 decades with businesses and investors, really moving them on a variety of sustainability issues. We've worked on the issue of climate risk and working with investors to move companies to reduce emissions and mitigate their climate risks. And I'd say about a dozen years ago, we really started to elevate the issue of water risk and really thinking about how can we get this critical financial risk to the private sector on the radar and elevate it to the level of climate risk. So about a dozen years ago, we started developing tools and peer learning groups for investors, really giving them the tools and the learnings to evaluate water risk within their portfolio, for example. So we still have one of those really groundbreaking tools that can be sourced on our website called the Investor Water Toolkit, where investors have a how-to guide of how to really evaluate water risk within their portfolios and then take the necessary action to mitigate that risk. So we've developed a lot of these learnings over time. We've facilitated various engagements with investors and the private sector on water risks. But, about 3 years ago, as Jay said, we were really thinking about, how can we elevate this work? How can we bring more investors to the table? Similar to what Ceres and our partners have accomplished on the climate side, we simply need more investors under the tent, so to speak, in order to really make the progress on mitigating water risk that matches the scope and the scale of the problem that we all know so well. And so in doing so, we had a core group of about 150 investors working with us in our peer learning group called the Investor Water Hub. And we started to really survey the investors and try to understand, what is needed to bring more investors to the table? How can we really elevate this issue of water risk? And so we sort of honed in on 3 main areas that we really needed to address before we could really get to the level of engagement that we were seeing on the climate side. And so the first piece of work that we'll be talking about squarely with the global assessment is the scientific case. So really, drawing from the climate side, the IPCC and many other scientific reports on climate and the risks associated with that are, more available to many different audiences, including, the financial community. So we realized that one gap on the water side is, of course, there's a plethora of academic research and science out there, conducted probably many of you in this room, but we really weren't finding it compiled in a way that sort of brought everything together in terms of, industry impacts to water resources and really, spelled it out in a coherent way for the financial community and, hopefully other audience as well. So, that was sort of the basis of working and putting forward this RFP to work with Jay and his team to really fill that scientific gap. Just really briefly, while not the focus of today's discussion, the other 2 core pieces of work were really building out that business case. Of course, for the financial community, you have to put things in terms of dollars and cents and really, compel more investors to join us based on really more fully articulating the business case of, water risk and the financial value at risk. So my colleague, Paul Rieg, who will be joining us shortly, collaborated with Ceres to help build out that case, and he'll share a little bit more about that. So that was the second, core gap that Ceres and our partners were trying to fill. And then the third one was using all of this previous research, so the first and second sort of core foundation, and really pulling that and drawing from that to develop a framework that investors can use as they go into these discussions with the companies that they own to hopefully move them forward in mitigating their water risk. Again, drawing from the science side of things, we have a more clear-cut ask that's more easily understood by investors on the climate side. 1.5 degrees C align with Paris. But on the water side, we really didn't have that type of framework. So with that, we drew from the science and drew from our core stakeholders. We formed an advisory committee of 14 pension funds from around the globe to inform all of these 3 pillars. And just a week ago, we launched what we call the corporate expectations for valuing water. And you can find this on our website. And this will be the framework as investors go into conversations with companies on how to mitigate their water risk. So now with these 3 key pillars in place, what's next for us? Well, just again, last week we launched the engagement phase of the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. So we currently have 64 institutional investors representing nearly 10 trillion in assets under management, who are going to be focusing on the companies that they own that have large water footprints and engaging with them to mitigate those risks and really draw from the science and draw from all the research to really form impactful engagements and really focus on the right elements to move the needle. So, when I reflect on the scientific analysis, I think there's really, 3 key pieces that will really help inform these engagements and make them all the more powerful and all the more impactful. First is, I think, as you'll see in Jay's presentation, I believe that the global assessment makes a really clear-cut case as to industry impacts to our water resources being severe and systemic. And so really with making this clear-cut case, investors in the financial community can't sort of hide behind, oh, that's a local one-off issue. No, in fact, the science is showing that this is a severe and systemic issue that we're facing. Also, the report hones in on the sectors and the industries where we're seeing the most severe impacts. And probably most of you in this room could guess what most of those are, but now we have the science behind that really helps us focus and hone in our efforts. And then also the report really also hones in on the certain practices within those industries that are leading to those severe impacts. So with all of that scientific evidence and data in hand, investors will have the information to really formulate, the asks of companies and really hone in on the areas where we can create the biggest impact. So with that, I will note, if you want to learn more about the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, we had a virtual session on it last Tuesday. So welcome you to go back and listen to the recording and learn all about that. But hopefully that gives you a bit of context of how this report really fits in as a core element of us moving forward with the investment community on addressing water risk. So with that, Palash, back to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, as Kirsten was mentioning, the work that we're doing right now collaboratively is based on those scientific evidence. And Jay's gonna share some of those key findings right now with us. So Jay, over to you.
Thank you, Palash. Next slide. That's a good one. Okay, so this is a good place to start. So thanks, Kirsten, for that background. And so you can tell it's been quite a journey, and I hope that it has an impact. There's trillions of dollars that are I think hopefully going to be deployed through investor conversations. And I was saying earlier, my eyes kind of cross over when I think about all those zeros, but that's a really great thing because it could have a huge, hopefully has a huge impact. So I want to kind of step you through the report a little bit, and then we've got some links at the end. But it was a science-based synthesis, a literature review, global evidence, mostly a peer-reviewed literature, and some reports as well, on industry impacts on water and also on impacts of water and climate change on industry. So there's that two-way materiality. And so you'll see this slide a few times, and I'll kind of try to illustrate each of the steps. So steps 1 and 2, finding out the papers that we're going to review. And we did start with about 3 million. So thanks, Kirsten. And then we use that to identify the key sectors and industries. Then we use the DIPSR framework that some of you are familiar with, the drivers, pressures, impacts. We'll get into that. And then we had to synthesize and do some ratings and then make some, or rank ratings of like sort of risk level, and then make some recommendations. Next slide. I love showing this slide because it's really colorful and it makes me feel like a real data scientist, but this is just kind of like a network analysis and then clustering analysis of starting with like the 3 million papers and how it breaks down into topical areas, like the one, say the blue one has to do with agriculture, and the orange one on the left has to do with treatment of wastewater, and I think the yellow one at the top has to do with aquaculture and fisheries. So we can start to group these things because we're not going to, read 3 million papers ever. Next slide. So then we take each individual cluster and break it down a little more. And long story short, again, I like showing the pretty pictures, but it was a way to get this huge number of papers down from the millions to the thousands, then to just a few hundred that we really focused on that were really representative of the broader area. Next slide. So one of the things that popped out from the clustering right away is the key sectors and the industries. So next slide, Palash. So this is one of the tables. So we've just pulled out tables from the reports, and I'm not going to go through them all, but maybe pull out some examples. But these are the key things that pop out of the literature. So the sectors along the top, so consumer staples, discretionary energy, and so on. And then the industries that fall beneath those sectors. And no surprises there. But like Kirsten was saying, it's really good to have this mountain of evidence to say, like, that wasn't just one paper. That was like, these guys looked at 3 million papers. Next slide, please, Palash. So then step 4, you can go to the next slide, is the DIPSR framework, the drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and responses. And so some of you are familiar with that framework, but think of it this way. We needed a framework. So we're down to several hundred papers that we need to read in reports. But we've hired a bunch of graduate students and undergraduates to help us read through these papers and write summaries. And you can't just ask 10 different people to write reviews, because then you just have even more of a headache on your hands. So we gave them this framework and actually made spreadsheets so they could funnel the information into a database that then we could take and do the synthesis with. So I think I have an example in the next slide. So here's an example for packaged food. So you see some of the drivers of the actual sort of sub-industries and what's happening on the farm. So whether we're growing fruit or grains, then some of the pressures might be water pollution and water use. And some of the states might be the condition of the soil, how much organic matter there is, microbial contamination. And then some of the impacts over on the right side. So eutrophication, water quality degradation, economic impacts. And the responses is left blank there because we're hoping that working with the investors will lead to the responses. Next slide, please. So then we needed to synthesize, and I'll just show you a few tables. And we synthesized in a few different ways. It's we looked across different industries. You can look at one industry and go in deep, and the report has all these sort of variations in it. Next slide, please. So some of the synthesis. So here's an example and we did this for all the major sectors that we and industries that we listed on that first table. But so you can look in the value chain. Say, let's take an example here for food products. So on-farm production, and then for practices, we can look at irrigation. And then for irrigation, the externalities might be our water consumption, extraction, and then some of the freshwater impacts, stress, depletion, and some of the hotspots. India, China, Bangladesh, USA, usual suspects. Hey, Paul, welcome, no problem. Next slide, please. So another thing that the report revealed was 5 critical threats. So going through the papers and seeing these topics come up over and over and over again, and they're shown on the left column here. So eutrophication, groundwater depletion, diversion and water transfers, metals contamination, and plastic pollution, and then more detail as we go across the chart. Next slide, please. And then we even came up with some emerging threats. So PFAS, which we're hearing an awful lot about. In fact, we're finding out now that it's in our rain as well. So that's not good news. Pharmaceuticals and social conflicts and justice. And then again, more details as you go from left to right across the chart. So there's lots of charts like this in the report that we hope were super helpful. Next slide, please. And so we're into the rating and the scoring part of the report. Next slide. So again, we've got sort of different charts kind of sliced up in different ways, different slices through the data. And so this one's looking at risk associated with those top 5 critical threats, the eutrophication, groundwater depletion, metals, and so on, and looking at severity, systemic nature, and overall impact, and then risk levels with some of the industries that are associated with those on the right side. Next slide, please. So another way to look at this, is to kind of synthesize the data. Now in the left column, we're looking at all the industries that we identified. And then looking at supply chain, direct operations, and end-of-life issues, both quantity and quality of water, and then sort of ranking the risk. Next slide, please, Palash. One of the things I didn't mention is that climate change was an integral part of the report, but really comes through as a threat multiplier. So it's in everything that we're talking about. We didn't specifically talk about flooding and flood risk and drought risk. We talked more about, I think, groundwater depletion and changing in water availability. I think that Jose will be talking about some of the flood risk type stuff and how we incorporate that into what's happening at water plant. Next slide, please. And so then we get to the advice section of the report. And so these are mitigation strategies, and I won't read them all, but we could lump them together and say water quantity and water quality. We want industry to be assessing and monitoring and mapping and engaging and baselining and trying to improve. And I think it's reasonable to ask that industry return water to the environment, the same amount of water to the environment at the same or better quality. That might be a reasonable goal. We'll talk about that in our discussion section. Business integration, I think Kirsten mentioned it. We have to have this board level representation and accountability of water issues. We have to. We are not going to make any progress unless we get it to that level. And then the last 2 on the right side are really about engagement. So really being an advocate in your basin or in your groundwater, within your groundwater basin or surface water basin, and really try to engage in multi-level, multi-partner collaboration, because we don't have healthy river basins or healthy aquifers, we're not going to have healthy industry, and so those go hand in hand. Next slide, please. And finally, the role of investors. So this is in the report, and I hope that this is a real outcome. But this is not something, it's aspirational for me, and this gets, more into the realm of series. That investors have this awareness, they see some of the executive summary, that they identify some of the impacts, they look at some of the materiality briefs that Paul has written and really understand what's going on with industrial impacts on water. Then collaboration with us, with those of us in this room, so investors working with us, the nonprofits, the academics, the NGOs, the government agencies. We're not going to do this alone. And I did mention that there are not a lot of academics come to this meeting, so we could use your help in, when you think about it, when you're running sessions in the future, invite academics because this is a really important meeting, I think, we have to be, in my opinion, really have to be getting the best science out there. But that can't really happen if the scientists don't come to the meetings and connect and collaborate. And then, hopefully the investors will have some impact in their discussions and with business, and then hopefully that will lead to this transformation that is so much needed urgently. As we know, I think Kirsten mentioned the pace and the scale, and it's we're not matching the pace and the scale of the problem. I think that's it for me, Palash. Oh, and the report is available, these two, the series website and our water.ucest.ca. But I think that just goes back to the series website.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for that presentation. So we'll be hearing more about the collaboration piece later on in the panel discussion. We talked about the background, we talked about the findings of the report. Now, how those findings been utilized. We're gonna look at some of those aspects. So we have with us Jose Ignacio. Jose Ignacio is the co-founder and CEO of WaterPlan, a San Francisco-based tech company providing the most advanced climate platform to monitor and mitigate water risk. Originally born in the Patagonia city of Ushuaia, Jose Ignacio understands from a young age the criticality of protecting nature and water resources. Jose holds a master in engineering from ITVA and is a Y Combinator and Stanford Graduate School of Business alum. So Jose, over to you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Palash, for that amazing introduction. So just to get a little bit the audience and to see how many academics, like if we have like any academic here, like by any chance? All right. Well, like a few, right?
I think all the academics at the meeting are in this room.
No, but that's good. What about the public sector? Any? All right. What about the private sector? Right, most of you, amazing. Any institutional investors from the investor community?
They're afraid.
No, but that's good. That's good to know. I'm going to talk a little bit of the things that we have been learning, talking to a lot of different like stakeholders, a lot of companies, like and really listening to kind of the things that we believe that the gaps that are out there. I believe that this report and the work that this team put together is amazing. One of the things that we noticed a lot is basically the gap between best available science, for example, what Jay does for a long time, and what is basically used out there. So I believe that kind of reports and studies like this are pretty key in order to help bridge that gap. I believe that in order to do that, we need like a combination of different techniques. So I believe like using data science and really being able to understand like thousands of different like scientific reports is like a huge endeavor, and it's totally needed as a combination to other kind of techniques such as remote sensing, which are growing a lot, or hydrologic modeling, etc. So I really believe that the combination of different data sources is something that is pretty key to understand which are the underlying problems in each one of the different catchments and places where companies and investors operate, but also to make sense of how that impacts businesses, right? So I believe that this report was amazing for that, and the materiality briefs that Paul is building are like really amazing. And the other thing that I want to say is thinking about like the science and the opportunities which are out there, being able to access that information in a fast way and being able to use it and put it in practice, I believe that's super important. We've noticed that engaging investors and kind of like one of the main drivers for more institutions to pay more attention and action and investing in responses for water risk comes from investors, right? That's one of the main drivers that we have been seeing. Another obviously regulation and business continuity, but investors is super important. So the work that you're doing, Kristen, with that, I believe like super key, and we are seeing this kind of transformation and how different stakeholders are paying more attention to this. So just like to finalize kind of my initial kind of discussions, this is something that super important. We are seeing more and more in different industries how the combination of different remote sensing techniques, hydrologic modeling, and data science with local clear information and with validation of also the communities which are working there, it's super key to basically address with more spatial and temporal resolution, which are the main problems which are occurring in different locations, and to be able to select which are the right responses in order to make things happen, right? So super excited of being this kind of information out there, and to have more platforms and more innovation going out there, and having scientists working with software engineers, and to be able to access better information and make better decisions, right? So that's a little bit what I wanted to say, Palash. So
Thanks a lot, Jose. So the evidence we found, scientific evidence, has been used, as I was mentioning, by Paul at Blue Risk. So we're going to hear a bit about how that translates into decision-making agenda. So Paul is the founder of Blue Risk, an advisory services firm helping companies and investors respond to emerging water risk. Paul has nearly 15 years of experience helping organizations respond to water-related business risks, and has advised over 40 of the world's largest companies on a range of innovative solutions to assess risk, set targets, measure impact, and report progress towards addressing emerging water challenges. Prior to founding Blue Risk, Paul spent 9 years at the World Resources Institute, WRI, where he led the development of the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas and founded WRI's corporate water stewardship practice. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Palash, and thanks for the invitation. Sorry I was late. So I wanted to talk about, what's it take to use scientific information to inform investors, and then we'll use this series materiality briefs as an example of that. And what it boils down to, I think, is if we have to really oversimplify, is there are kind of four main things, right? The first is to acknowledge that not all investors are made equal, right? We talk about investors, but who are you trying to influence, right? Is it an investment bank? Is it a pension fund? Is it an impact investor, right? Is it a mainstream equity analyst on Wall Street, right? Understanding your audience, what type of financial institution, is crucial because they have extremely different needs. The second thing is, what type of decision are you trying to influence with the scientific evidence? Is it buy-sell? Are they going to actually make a buy-sell decision with this data? Are they screening a portfolio? Are they building an index? There are an emerging number of water indices out there now. What are they going to use it for, right? So that's the second really important piece. With insights into who your audience is within the investor community and what decisions they're going to make, the way we typically work is then we set out and we try to define a set of design principles or design criteria that specifies the type of scientific information needed to meet the audience needs and support the types of decisions they're making. And you really need to do that up front, because you have different requirements, right? A buy-sell decision is extremely different than weighting an index or screening a portfolio, right? So really understanding, and that's where this question of what's spatial and temporal granularity, what coverage do you need? Is it a global decision across geographies, or is it basin specific, or is it for one place but not another? So all of that goes into those design criteria. And then lastly, once you have your design criteria, you know what type of information to access from the scientific community. That's where we go into translating, right? And it's perhaps the most important step of all, right? You need to translate scientific evidence into actionable insights. Scientific evidence alone is extremely valuable, but maybe not quite enough to get an investor to change how they make a decision unless you translate it. So what do we mean by translating? We need to tell them what it means, right? Jay maybe knows what a coefficient of variance over 1 means for climate variability, or if we say, hey, groundwater table decline is over 4 centimeters a year and it's increased by twice since last year. Maybe a scientist can understand it, but an investor has absolutely no clue what it means, particularly because unless it's set into context for that basin, it's very, very difficult to understand. So you need to translate that, and you typically do that by building indicators that help normalize results and help give them perspective. And ideally, you try to embed those indicators into metrics that investors are familiar with already, right? So we do a lot of work that ends up being integrated into a profit and loss sheet for a company, right? Into a P&L sheet. Immediately you get attention from the finance team, you get attention from other stakeholders internally because they know what it is. They know what they're looking at. They know what every line item in the P&L is. So when you look at the implications of the scientific evidence on their P&L sheet, you're immediately speaking the same language, right? So those are kind of the four ingredients that we look to pursue when engaging investors and using scientific evidence for that. And I think a good example, just to bring this to light, is the work that Ceres did and we supported on assessing water-related materiality. We looked at two sectors. We looked at the apparel sector and we looked at packaged meat sectors, and we selected a number of publicly listed companies in both. And we used the scientific evidence from this study to identify what parts of their value chain were associated to impacts on freshwater resources, long-term chronic impacts. And with that, we were able to assess the magnitude of the impact associated to each of the listed companies. With the magnitude of the impact, we were able to assess the associated cost using cost curves to understand what the total cost was to address those impacts across the value chain. And with the cost in an economic model, we were able to integrate it into their P&L. So what impact does this additional cost have over 10 years on the company's P&L? And surprisingly, for some companies in some sectors, the impact on the P&L was quite large, right? So I think that's a good example to kind of highlight how we use those four steps or four ingredients to integrate scientific evidence into something that becomes actionable by investors. And both those briefs are available online if you're interested. So I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul. So we'll take questions later on in the session. Now we will have a few minutes of transition. We have a panel discussion coming up now. We'll have 4 people on stage, and the panel will be moderated by Jay. So we have with us Michael Nemeth. Mike leads Nutrient's global water stewardship and biodiversity efforts and supports Nutrient's carbon program and the opportunities around system solutions between these portfolios. Mike received his Master of Science with a concentration in hydrology and is a registered professional agrologist in the practice areas of environmental impact assessment and mitigation planning and water resources planning and management. He currently serves on the board of directors for Inside Education and has previously served as a board member for several local, national, and international organizations. So Mike, please, others, as I mention your names, feel free to join up on the stage. Next we have Kate Broman. Kate Broman is the Associate Director of the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama. Prior to this, she was a Water and Climate Resilience Fellow at the U.S. Department of Defense through AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellowship and a coordinating lead author for the 2019 IPBES Global Assessment. Broman's research includes assessment of worldwide trends in water consumption and availability, irrigation and agriculture water use, and the science and implementation of investments in watershed ecosystem services. Next we have Will Hughes. Will Hughes leads Amazon Web Services Global Water Sustainability Program, working within data centers to improve water efficiency and by investing in projects that build long-term resilience in the communities where AWS operates. Prior to AWS, Will worked in finance and policy roles across the water sector. Next, we have Felicia Marcus. Felicia is currently the Landert Visiting Fellow at Stanford's Water in the West program. She's been in government and the nonprofit sector, most recently as chair of the California State Water Resources Control Board, where she was responsible for water rights, water quality, drinking water, and other programs during the state's last drought. She's also been regional administrator of US EPA and the head of the City of Los Angeles Department of Public Works, in addition to senior leadership roles at the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Trust for Public Land. Felicia is also a member of the Water Policy Group, a network of current and former high-level national and international water policy officials. So Jay, over to you for moderating this part of the session.
Thanks, Palash. Before we start talking, I think we should do a quick round of applause for our speakers. That was really awesome. Okay, so let's get ready. So thanks everybody for agreeing to do this. And you know, full disclosure, the panel, they didn't really come together until a couple of days ago. But thanks everyone for doing it. So Kate, let's start with you. So you were on the scientific advisory committee that helped shape the report and then reviewed it. As an academic, what role do you think academia plays in writing reports like this? And how do they complement the things that we do in the academic literature?
I think you, Kirsten, really hit this on the head, actually, in both of your remarks, that there is a ton of literature out there.
Is your microphone on? It is a slow, there's a lag.
There's a ton of literature out there. And I don't know how many of you have tried to read academic papers. It's a slog.
Snooze.
Some of them, are you, I mean, I
Except
take
for
that personally.
Except for Kate's papers, they're quite awesome. Yeah.
But, you know, they are doing what they're designed to do in the peer review literature, but that doesn't make them necessarily or almost definitionally very useful beyond the academy. And I think a big part of what academics can do is both compile all that, because who else has graduate students that you can inflict reading 3 million papers on?
A lot of the people that, you know, in the audience probably don't know that, right? That like, it's, you know, I wouldn't say it's a master-slave relationship, but it's...
we're trying to move away from that.
Are.
We're working on better relationships
Yeah.
in the academy.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of folks who are actually interested in reading those papers, and we can take advantage of their enthusiasm. We can channel their enthusiasm. And I think connected to that is this real question of interpretation. Because even if you did slog through a bunch of papers about this, figuring out how important are they? What does this really mean? These all studied slightly different things. How do I compare them to one another? And the body of expertise that folks in academia have pulled together is really, I think, one of the biggest and best things that can come out of that is that interpretive part, so that you can take advantage of a lifetime, years of expertise, and saying, look, here's the bottom line. This is what this means. And particularly in this context, I appreciated thinking that Paul brought up, thinking about what questions are people actually trying to answer? And how do we interpret these studies that can inform lots of different things? How do we interpret them in that context to make them actually useful?
Thanks so much. So Mike, over to you. You work for Nutrien, which by the way is based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where I'm from, although we have only met virtually before, and Mike lives in Calgary. But can you tell us about Nutrien's water journey, and do you think a report like this will have any impact?
Yeah, well, as a company, we started our, I guess, water stewardship journey a couple years ago. When we merged, two companies merged in 2018 to form Nutrien. At that point, we focused primarily on our climate strategy. Fast forward 2 years later, and we started looking at water stewardship, but we really wanted to make sure that we did water stewardship properly. So we were taking international best practices, best standards. We wanted to have credibility, transparency in what we were doing, and then have a lot of trust that what we ended up with in terms of goals and targets were going to be impactful and meaningful. So we piloted a corporate water stewardship accelerator with the Water Council out of Milwaukee in the US. And then we also adopted the AWS standard as a company, just in terms of a framework that we can use and gives credit to our our process, and we looked at everything from our site-based risk assessments, from a watershed perspective, making sure that we took in the context of each of our sites. We wanted to make sure that we built goals and targets that were not just blanket statements, that they were actually meaningful at the sites, and that we addressed risk where it was appropriate to address risk, to make sure that from a business perspective, we were not putting ourselves at operational risk, reputational risk, or financial risk, and that at the end of the day, we were setting targets where we could work outside of our fence lines and operational boundaries to improve water stewardship in the watersheds where we operated. So that was kind of our journey in a nutshell. And then I think at the, reports like this, as Jay said, this was kind of thrown together this weekend, but I did flip through the report and I read the executive summary. And I find reports like this are good because they highlight, in my mind, they help highlight the urgency and the need to be able to actually act, and not just act alone, but act together. Because whether you look at the sectors or the impacts individually or at a whole, no one company, no one industry, no one group can do water stewardship or address these independently. You have to act together, you have to collaborate. So it brings, I think, another spotlight on water, which is always good because water seems to fall out of the limelight unless there's an emergency. It's always kind of out of the light unless you need it. Climate tends to dominate the discussion, and then tying it, as the study did, tying it to climate change, and then recognizing that the old saying goes, climate is water, water is climate. You impact the temperature and the precipitation changes, and you're going to impact your water availability. So I think it just really highlights the need to collaboratively work together.
Thank you, Mike. So Felicia, you've spent a large part of your career in the regulatory and policy space. I want to ask you about the importance of financial solutions, like we've heard about with the series approach to working with investors, versus policy and regulatory solutions.
Great, thanks for asking. Hi, everyone. I'm looking this way because I'm going to have to hold on to the table so I don't fall
It's harder
over
than it looks.
from jet lag.
Yeah.
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
I even wrote notes because I thought I won't be able to get through it. I do think, in general, having been around it on sort of all sides of these issues, I think we need an all of the above strategy, right? So it's not an either or. We need everybody in this to try and deal with the nightmare that's coming at us with climate change, and frankly, the nightmare that's already here and could have been here either because of geological history that's shown we've had 40 and 400-year droughts, or the anthropogenic effort that you highlighted, particularly during our drought of the last decade, where your pictures, I think, had a huge impact.
Pictures of me in particular.
You in particular, yeah, pictures of him. Pictures of the overdrawn Central Valley groundwater basins, and how fast that had a massive impact, I think, in the public consciousness about how badly we had gone wrong, and I think it made a big difference. And I think the private sector is really critical to this, and generally I think the private sector level can sometimes accomplish change far more rapidly and at larger scale once employed than the public sector. I mean, sometimes it takes a policy nudge to start it, and sometimes a shove, for sure. But other times, policy is following what the private sector wants, generally early adopters who want a level playing field. In government, frankly, we get more of our tips on enforcement from other businesses than we do from public interest groups. People don't realize that, because folks who are trying to do the right thing, either because they want to follow the rules or they want to, there's this whole demographic change that's happened over the 30 years I've been looking at it, of CEOs, of board members, and of investors being far more socially conscious, employees, consumers, et cetera. I mean, there's a huge movement there that can have a huge impact, and so frequently you do have industry pushing the envelope for good. Other times it takes a shove, and when we talk about risks, that comes up. This is like kind of different than the air and climate worlds, where you get that too, but there's a much more, I've been in all of them, a much more aggressive and robust enforcement effort, even though they're more Clean Water Act enforcement citizen suits than for anything else. It's a feature of the statutes, but in water, just as Mike was saying, it's under the radar more often than not, except in a crisis. And so I think investors who are really engaged can make an enormous difference in giving a reality check to folks in an industry for whom business as usual is not out of the question, and where pride in what they do can blind them to the externalities of what they do. And so I liked about the fact of the report that it highlighted both serious risks, physical risks to companies, but also reputational risk. And I don't know which one is worse, physical or political, but they're both pretty bad. And I have found in talking with, anonymize the point, to industries that come in and say, well, let me follow the law, will I be okay? And my answer is, generally in other industries, I'll say, if you stink, glow in the dark, or go boom in the night, telling a community that you're meeting the minimum standards set by a government agency is not going to make them your best friends, because they don't trust you and they don't trust us either. And so you always, if you actually want to be in relationship with a particular watershed you're in, and the watershed work is among the most interesting, I think, over the past, again, decades I've been looking at it, the shift from just internal water efficiency to actually taking an active role in the watershed one's in, including WASH, including a whole bunch of things, including multiple benefits, really requires a much bigger vision, and it requires the support of boards and investors. And we've seen examples of where CEOs have gone out aspirationally because they think it's in the better long-term business interests of their companies, and they've gotten slapped, and other times they've gotten rewarded. So, I mean, it requires all of them, but I'll anonymize one and then stop. Having this company say, well, we're worried about running short of water, what if we make sure we buy water rights, or we try to make a deal with a municipality, or we make sure, and I said, you know what, that piece of paper is gonna do you absolutely no good in a drought. When you show the piece of paper and the neighbors all around you have their wells running dry, and that is the conundrum of water rights in general. Just let's look at the Colorado, like right now.
Yep.
So in any event, I do think it's really encouraging to see the shift, but I also think the work in this to highlight the issues of risk, but also say, this is important to the future of the company, is really, really timely. And I think any of us who've had the opportunity to be a regulator in particular, let alone an advocate, you get to see everybody from the dais, and there's very much of a mix between folks in industries that are proud and can see the risk, the dairies that can see that they're proud to provide milk to kids, but they're poisoning their water. That took about 9 months for the dairy industry in the 90s, a big portion of it, to realize it. And there are other industries that for 30 years have been bellyaching about why we're being so mean to them, who just can't see it because they either keep the lights on or they keep your car running or whatever it is. And that's what really takes the investors to give the reality check, because any institution comes up with a self-congratulatory circle of pride, but you've got to be able to pierce it.
Thanks, Felicia. Will, I wanted to follow up on a conversation that we started in Singapore. I think there was beer involved. In fact, I know there was. And that's on the need for education in the private sector on corporate water stewardship. Can you please share your thoughts on why you think more education is necessary?
Sure. I think the best way that we can educate is by leading by example, and that's what we're trying to do. We've been, like Nutrien, I think in a similar timeline, we've been working on water stewardship for the past couple of years. For those who don't know, Amazon Web Services is the data center side of Amazon. A lot of the internet runs on Amazon data centers, and we use water for cooling them. So that's the tie-in here. And there's the whole water energy nexus is very clear. It's nowhere clearer, I think, than in a data center, where if you use more water, you can save energy, and if you use more energy, you can save water. And so we're trying to manage both of those together to optimize and reduce our impact on both of those resources. And so, it varies from industry to industry in terms of how, where your impacts lie and how you need to address those. We are certainly working within our data centers to minimize the water footprint, to switch to more sustainable water sources like recycled water. We do not. We would love to use recycled water everywhere we could. We don't need to be using potable water for cooling our data centers. In some places, we're also providing the spent cooling water to farmers for use in irrigation directly, because it's non-contact cooling water. It doesn't. All that happens is as you evaporate water, whatever was in there to begin with concentrates, but there's no added bad stuff that we put in there. So those are kind of the strategies within our data center fence line. But then I think to the larger question of how we're using data within the program, one of the for me, really interesting questions is how we're using data to invest in water availability within communities. So we are working with Water Plan and to answer a couple of really key questions, one of which is, how should we be prioritizing our investments across the different areas where we operate around the world? How should we be thinking about what the most urgent water-related issue is in a given basin? And then even I think one of the holy grails is once you figure that out, where within a watershed, if you're focused on watershed restoration, where should we be investing? And can we use tools to help us better refine our investment strategy around water availability and water replenishment? Because if you figure that question out, I think you can. It's like you're getting a whole bunch more money if you're more effective in how you're investing that. And so those are the ways that we're integrating. I haven't read the report, but I'm sure many of those insights are integrated into the type of tools that we're using. And I think there's a unique role that the corporate sector can play. I think on a lot of issues around water we've seen in the past decades, the public sector can't do it alone. I mean, you look at some of the water quality issues in the Chesapeake Bay. We've been trying to clean that up. We've made some progress, but there's a long way to go still. And so what I'm interested in thinking about is how can we use the capital that we have available to address these challenges? How can we use data to optimize how we're making those investments and really help, kind of get behind the wheel with the public sector and help push on some of those challenges? And how can we not just fund a project, right? Not just write a check on a one-off and say, here you go do some work, but use the capital that we have to leverage that, invest in the innovative financing models and business models and technologies that will help us achieve more. So I think we're not necessarily the ones that are going to, we're not going to come up with all the solutions on our own, but I think we can help highlight what works and use the kind of mentality around innovation that we have within our companies to accelerate progress on these challenges. So that's what we're trying to do. Hopefully, as we get some more of those data points, to actually answer your question a little bit, because I've mostly ignored it. But as we get more of those data points and more of those success stories, hopefully that builds some momentum around educating how we can do better within corporate water stewardship. So, I think that's where I see my role and the most opportunity, just because the question of if you're investing in corporate water stewardship is hard to influence from the outside. Every company has its own set of internal politics and processes that you have to get through to get to that point, and you can nudge them in the right direction. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of getting a corporate to start caring about it.
Right.
But what we can do is start to show how we can do better once companies are there.
We should have a traveling road show. We can just visit all the major industries. We can come to AWS, right? We can come to Nutrien. Mike, I should have asked you to tell the audience what Nutrien does.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that. Nutrien is the world's largest integrated agricultural company. So we produce and distribute phosphates, potash, and nitrogen fertilizers across the world. And then we have the world's largest integrated agriculture retail network. So we work directly with over 500,000 growers in 11 countries to work and provide them not just with crop inputs like crop nutrients, crop protection products, and seeds, but also digital solutions and technologies to help make farms more profitable, more efficient, and more sustainable. So that's what we do.
Well, so then let me ask you, I said earlier, and I kind of a broken record on this point. I continue to make the comment that industry should strive to return the same amount of water to the environment at the same or better quality than it was withdrawn. So that's kind of my take on, water neutral or water positive, which I know are ill-defined terms right now. But do you think that's an appropriate goal, an achievable goal? I prepped you with that question earlier.
I know, and I've been thinking about this,
Yeah, okay.
and I think the key word there is strive.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
We can strive.
Yeah.
I'm going to put caveats on that because caveats are great. But I think the important part is that yes, you can strive. But I think it's more important to understand that, and anybody who was in the session this morning on more, I can't remember what it was, more than looking at the social benefit, looking outside of just volumetric accounting, I guess. Volumetric accounting, that's the word I was looking for. So you have to look at the context of the watershed. So in some watersheds, that might be possible. For some industries, that might be possible. We have facilities that produce more water than we withdraw. So at the end of the day, we're discharging more clean water than we withdraw on a regular basis. The only discharges or the only losses we have are evaporation and then some of the water that goes into liquid products, and that's it. There are facilities where it's not going to be possible to do a volumetric replacement or compensation to get neutral, but you might be able to look at a nature-based solution where somehow, somewhere, somebody who's much smarter than me can account for the fact that if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to contribute to the water holding retention of the watershed and therefore replenish or replace X amount of cubic meters of water. I also, this is just my personal opinion, so yes, it's possible. We should always strive to make things better than or as good as when we were there. But I also think that it's important that we look at what's the best value if we're investing in water replenishment or water neutral. Is it investing in a watershed where the water's actually there and it's within the holding capacity of the watershed to carry that industry? Or do we invest outside of that watershed in an area where, that nature-based solution might actually provide more benefit, more social value, more bang for your buck somewhere else? And that also rubs people the wrong way because people always say, well, if you're in a watershed, you should do the mitigation or you should do the replenishment in the watershed. So that's why I say we should strive. We probably can do it, but every context and every situation is going to be different.
So, what I get out of your comments, Mike, and yours, Will, is that, there is no one size fits all. And so we need to really understand, right, like what your company does, what its water, what its mission is, what its water use requirements are, rather than, making blanket statements. It's good to actually understand, right, to
Absolutely.
have tailored metrics. So Felicia, back to you. You just released a report that I saw was all over Twitter. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, just a little, and then I'll focus on the link to this conversation
Sure.
that's in it, which is what I found. It was a mouthful. It was about the synergies between state climate policies in the Colorado Basin states and nature-based solutions that yield multiple benefits, particularly for water. So it ended up being less of an academic paper than kind of a primer, sort of about state climate policy for water people, about nature-based solutions and all these great things you can do with state climate policy for policymakers, in addition to meeting the climate challenge. And it was interesting because I went in without preconceptions, and probably the most important thing people have gotten out of it is that beavers are cool. How many of you know that?
Yeah. Well, I live in Canada now, so I know.
No, that's
I know.
right. The
Yeah.
national creature. But it is, beaver believers and all of that. So the puns and things are plays on words are endless. But truly incredibly important, and that this tsunami of money is coming in to forest management. It's still a drop in the bucket, but at least in the U.S. we've got 1 billion burnable acres, and it's just not your normal burnable acres. It's outsized conflagrations because of the lack of management of the forests and a few degrees temperature rise. So we've got tinderboxes that are swamping now fossil fuel emissions in many places. And so this is the space for climate, and there are water implications. What's tied into here was that one of the things I immediately ran into was the issue of quantification and the need for quantification. And generally, I have counseled scientists to never come in and start with more study needed as their main conclusion, period. Nothing else insightful for the policymakers, because it drives us a little bit nuts. And in this case, you know, you can know a good thing when you see it, but I think more quantification will be helpful. I did find that the regulatory offset market, I won't get into it, is a much smaller play than people may think, given the outsized media attention it gets. But I got really interested in the corporate net zero water and climate, net water positive impact, the work of a lot of the tech firms and a lot of the food and beverage firms. And I see that as a place where you can find a synergy that's going to do good on climate, good on relationships, particularly in a watershed. But it still needs quantification. And Mindy Lubera series wrote a pretty good paper about nature-based solutions, and it's not just throw money at tree removal. You've got to actually do it the right way, make sure you're not having adverse societal impacts. I mean, you really do have to take that holistic look, and I found that arena really quite fascinating. But from an academic standpoint, you know, this is a place where more study is needed to allow us to fine-tune how we spend our money and make sure we're really doing ecological forest management that's going to yield multiple benefits versus just, you know, taking out trees because they drink water. So it's a much more sophisticated range that we have to get into. And the fact that if you then integrate meadow restoration and beavers and all of that, you accelerate the multiple benefits, climate sequestration, water quality, et cetera. So there's huge potential out there. So I found it very life-affirming after having been, you know, such a hard-boiled regulator for so long. But it's the space to go.
And congratulations on getting that report out.
Just getting it done.
I know,
was like the
it's
hardest thing
right. I
ever.
know. Tell me about it.
Yeah.
So, Kate, over to you. I want to drill down onto this lack of academics, although there's a good showing here. But in general, I don't know. I mean, why are there not more academics here? Do you think our colleagues are disinterested? I mean, I think they need to be more engaged. I mean, just what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of our colleagues are engaged, and you see that in the work that they do put out. And I accuse myself of this, as I say. I have yet to see an academic that didn't start out in the introduction of their paper saying, "This is extremely decision-relevant research."
Of course.
And it very well may be, and yet we still have this problem of specific studies in specific places that need to be generalized if they're going to be used by folks in practice, multiple studies that need to be synthesized, and reinterpreting for specific users. And all of those problems are never going to cease to be problems. And I'm not actually completely convinced that academics should or can answer those questions. And I think this is really where the need for boundary organizations comes into place. And we talk about boundary organizations in lots of different contexts. In this context, what I really mean is basically research to operations, something that in many ways doesn't look that different from consulting, but is really designed to take the information that's being generated in academia. I did a super cool study, and I created a really cool data set, and you can find it on my website if you know to look for it, bringing those data into centralized places. I did an awesome study. I found an algorithm to do this one thing in this one place. Well, can we update that so that it's recent if somebody wants to use it? Can we expand that so that it has implications for other places? Those are not things that, in general, anybody in academia has the money or the time to do. And again, I'm not sure that we want to pay them to do it. I think places like your organization, right? You know, you're thinking about global water security. I am now helping to start up a center that's doing something similar. the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama. By the way, if you want water for your data centers, move to Alabama. We have a lot of water. But I think, it's a different skill set. You need to understand the academic, but you also need to understand what decision makers and specific decision makers are, what information they need. You need to get that question right. You need to get the salience right, and you need to build a legitimacy. And that takes a different skill set, as well as taking time and money that academia is just not really well designed to provide. And so I think, yes, it would be great to have more academics here, but what we need are more academic boundary organizations that can be here and that can be that bridge.
Thank you very much. And Will, we're going to give you the last word. And I'm fond of saying that we can't move the needle, and I think I said it today. We can't move the needle on global water security without deep industry engagement. And in this post that Jose and I just wrote for World Economic Forum, we call on industry to join forces with the public sector, nonprofits, and academia to provide the global leadership that is essential for adapting to the climate water risk and for advancing adaptation to a rapidly changing water cycle. I know it's a lot to remember, but do you think we can all work together? That's the bottom. That's the question. Can we, is that like, you can maybe build on what Kate was just saying with boundary organizations. I think, and it came up earlier, this is really an all hands on deck moment. And it requires, it's a huge problem when you put the quality and the quantity together, and the pace and the scale at which all this stuff is changing. I only showed in that slide, that was just the quantity side. When you overlay the quality side, it's pretty scary. Can we do this? You're Amazon, man.
Yeah, let's go. Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, and I think it's just going to take. I think there'll be a lot of appetite for it once we show some results and show that some corporates coming together in collaboration with universities, with nonprofits, with governments, that there's a lot, not just money and funding that we can bring, but expertise in understanding agricultural supply chains really well can be a huge benefit in figuring out how to start to transition maybe some water back to ecosystem use and to other uses within in cities. And Amazon, with the cloud expertise that we have in technology, we can help bring solutions to the table, help water utilities adopt more technology that can help them figure out where they're losing water within their system, so that they can avoid losing 30 or 40 or in some cases 50% of the water that they send out of treatment plants doesn't get to anybody, and all the carbon emissions that are associated with that as well. So I think not just thinking about in terms of the bean counting part of like a water neutral or water positive, that can be an organizing principle, but I think more importantly, it's asking the question of what unique skills can we bring to the table in addition to funding to help solve those problems. And I do think, for all the companies that have these types of water goals, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out, okay, what should we work on, what should we invest in, and having local academics involved who know those watersheds, who could help figure out, you can do a lot of great work with data to figure out that can help you zero in on what those challenges are that you should be addressing, but having some real local expertise as well that can tell you the data is right, or actually this is where we should be focusing instead. I think those are the ways that those are the types of connections that need to be drawn between the different types of organizations. I do think that it can be a real accelerant for making progress on some of these challenges.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. I think, Palash, do you want to
Sure.
come back up and we can have questions for
Sounds
everybody?
good. Thank you so
For
much.
our speakers. Let's
Let's have a quick round of applause. Yes. Yeah. So we'll take a couple of questions now, because I think we have only one mic, so we'll have to pass it on to the audience.
Oh, that's right. And it can be for the speakers too. So
Yes.
I see that Paul escaped, but Jose is here and I'm here.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I will start. Thank you so much. hard to kick it off. My name is Katawana. I work for Sustainalytics Morningstar. So we are an ESG data provider, ESG data and rating and research provider, and our clients are the biggest investors out there, as well as more and more corporates who want to understand how they are benchmarking against their other peers, right? So I really appreciate the report you put out there and the collaboration behind it. It's been years of work. And I can just confirm from our side, when the ESG, we are like an intermediators between investors, companies, and the science and policy community. So it's a bit of a difficult to define who we are and how we can use the science that's put out there. I can confirm how water has been under the radar for so many years, because our framework also reflects and mirrors just from a materiality perspective. So it's often difficult to match the materiality driven by water among other ESG issues as we translate the sustainability issues for water as a cross-cutting issue, but also as a standalone issue. So there are so many ways that we could confirm our findings based on the report you put out, but also there are so many other areas of collaboration that I'm seeking as well when we are building our framework on supply chain or exposure capturing management of indicators on management. So there are multiple areas. So maybe it's not a question, but more of putting myself out there. There is a need for more and more of these types of
the
reports.
beauty of this is that, you know, this is followed by a cocktail hour, so we can just have a discussion. So it sounds like you probably have a lot of people that you can chat with. So thank you for that.
We'll take comments and a couple of questions from the audience first, then we'll allow the panelists to answer.
Hello, thank you very much for all of this information. And one of the things that I'm taking away, that your report kind of breaks down the silos that we've all been operating within. And so that makes it easier for all of us to do our work. I have a theory about your academics. If you go to water conferences that are much more highly technical, usually I'm the only non-academic. But I did want to ask one question about stormwater, because it's becoming flooding. You talked about that earlier on, and the role of stormwater and how industry is managing the big factories and the amount of water that roof systems collect. What are they doing to mitigate the flooding that they create because non-permeable surfaces, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Felicia, that could be a good one for you. What do you think? I don't want to. I don't want to talk about that.
An academic who crossed into the public policy thing to put himself in the shoes of the people he could just opine about. That's a noble and important thing to have done. It depends on where you are, of course. The answer in water is always it depends. But I can only speak for California, where there are a couple of different ways of looking at it. We have fairly robust industrial general permit and MS4 permit. So there's in many of them, the industry has to either treat everything or capture 85% of what falls on their land. So those are some of the ways. I don't know how other states are implementing it, but it's pretty massive regulatory implementation, and Kirsten knows this very well from her prior life. It may be more aggressive in some ways in California, but in the wetter parts of the country where you have nutrient issues and pig farms and all the CAFOs, there's an awful lot of work going on in nutrient management. And there you have also nature-based solutions as a suggestion, where you're having companies in some places pay into restoring whole watersheds so that it can collect. So it kind of depends on where you are in the given system. So either in the municipal stormwater permitting or in the industrial stormwater permitting, there are a range of things going on. Ideally, you're also going to be either capturing it for reuse or making sure it's cleansed before it gets into a water body that may need it. If it's in some water bodies, they need more water. In others, that water is of no use to the ocean in places like, and then I'll stop, places like LA County, which long a laggard, passed a $300 million a year in perpetuity fund to everybody to pay a fee, and you're going to start seeing over the course of the next decade the face of the County of LA change as they put it into multiple benefit urban greening for flood control, capturing water, getting it in the ground, which they really need, and what rolls across that green space is cleansed by that magic touch of nature, which is real, and then ends up cleaning what goes out to the bay and the harbor. So these kind of integrated multiple benefit approaches are there, but it's a lot harder than point source or recycling or anything else. So it's going to take a while.
I just want to chime in on that. So I'm only a relatively recent Alabama transplant, which you might have guessed from my accent. But I spent the last 10 years in Minnesota, which is a pretty progressive place and has actually a corporate sustainability working group. And one of the things that working group put together was both an ask for and then production of guidance for dealing with water on corporate campuses, because they were very much wrestling with this issue. Corporate campuses and also retail sites. And part of this was, and I wonder, how this chimes for Will and Mike, that what you see on your campus is an incredibly visceral impact on water, even if it's not actually the biggest impact that your company has on water. And so, what we were hearing was that there was a lot of interest in doing this kind of water management. And I suspect that that's true in other places, even though this was really only a state level organization.
Yeah, within the corporate context, I think stormwater typically is just looked at from a compliance obligation standpoint, and it's pretty decentralized. But I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of the water stewardship program that I lead at Amazon, and we're trying to respond to whatever the biggest challenge is in a given basin. In some places, it's not about scarcity. Sometimes it's about water quality. And so I am developing a lot of innovative stormwater projects using innovative technologies, financing approaches that I think will be scalable, and trying to kind of look across the portfolio, cross-cutting, look at all of the assets in a company like Amazon to figure out how we can go above and beyond compliance, and then link up with others in a given watershed, and say, okay, we're all on this river here. I've got this, and I can actually do some more over here. I can put in a smart pond system and expand the capacity and take it from the 20-year to the 50-year or the 100-year storm that it can manage. What can you do over there? And if you can link that up, and potentially back to the collaboration point together or before, talk with the county and the other public entities in the region that have compliance obligations, I think you can start to scale that into something more meaningful at a basin level. But it will definitely take a bit of a mindset change, since I think for the most part, we're coming from a place of just looking at it from compliance, and it's just the local, whoever the project manager is, it's that person at that local level saying, all right, what do I have to do? All right, can I check that box? But there's definitely room to go above and beyond.
I think that's all the time we had today. You can connect with the speakers and with the panelists as well in the after hour. And again, join me giving a quick round of applause for the speakers and panelists. Yes, and enjoy the rest of the World Water Week. Thank you.
Thanks.